And it's Friday night with Byline Times. I'm Peter Jukes.
And I'm Hardeep Matharu. And over the next hour, we will bring you what the papers don't say.
And what the TV doesn't tell you. Now, unlike other channels, we're not funded by a license fee or Dubai hedge funds or advertising. We are funded solely by you. And to keep going, we'd appreciate it if you want to speak to us later, ask us questions. You can go and fund us on patreon.com/Byline TV. That's patreon.com/Byline TV. And if you pay something there, you can stick around after the show and ask us anything you like. Now, coming up tonight, there is obviously something big on all our minds, and that's the Hartlepool by-election, the disastrous results for Labour there, the council elections, and coming out over this weekend, we have elections in London, Scotland and Wales. So that's going to be our main subject, and it's great joining us tonight, along with our political reporter Sam Bright, is Paul Mason, a great thinker on the left, and he'll be looking with Hardeep and Sam at the biggest structural issues underlying Labour's problems, not just in the north but in small towns. Following that, we have looked a lot, as you know, at PPE and other examples of crony contracts. Now, we are delighted to be joined tonight by Dorothy Byrne. First time outside of working as editor-at-large at Channel 4, she can tell the truth about what goes on in media, and we can look with Julian Petley at where there's another kind of cronyism, and that's the cronyism of public appointments. We've seen it at Ofcom, potentially with Paul Dacre at the BBC and Channel 4. So that'll be the second half of our programme. But before I leave, because I'm far too far from the south and Sam takes my pace, let's look at a clip from a year ago when Paul Mason, our guest tonight, spoke to Joe Politics about why he was backing Keir Starmer for leader of the Labour Party.
Paul Mason, thanks for joining us.
A pleasure.
Appreciate it. You're backing Keir Starmer to be the next Labour leader. Why?
Well, it's not about Keir Starmer. For me, Labour just suffered a historic defeat, which young people watching this programme will feel the effects of. There will be less money in the economy. I think there will be less hope in the economy. We're seeing even today the government basically throw money at an airline. That's what, the airline industry is a polluting, planet-destroying industry. So those of you, who'll be still alive in the 2050s will be reaping the rewards of putting a right-wing conservative racist government into power. So people on the left, and by the left I mean progressive people who vote SNP, Labour, Green, Plaid Cymru, just anarchists on the street, people in the Extinction Rebellion movement. We've got to work out how this one part of politics, and it's one part which is winning power in a democratic state, how we do that. Climbing over barriers and protesting against the coup that Boris Johnson took part in September 2019. But getting power in a democratic state to enact left and green politics is a really big part of politics. And for me, I want Labour people to think really carefully about what went wrong before they start coming out with what the answer is. And to me, many of the other candidates had a kind of pre-prepared answer. Lisa and Andy, it's all about towns. Effectively, we need to listen to people who are kind of nostalgic about the old Britain. Well, we do need to listen to them, but I'm afraid there are things we can't offer them. A guy came up to me on the street and said, when Boris gets in, I hope he rounds up all the Romanians in this town and their children, throws them in the back of a van, locks the door and drives them to Dover tomorrow. Okay? Now, those of us who are involved in politics have to admit that those sentiments exist. I'm not saying that everybody who voted Tory is racist, or that everybody who voted Brexit is racist, but out there in civil society and on the internet, people watching this know, unfortunately, the culture war is here, like it is in America. And one of the things Labour got wrong is that it didn't want to fight it. It said almost like, shit, if the culture war's here, we're...
Do you think Keir Starmer is the person to fight that battle?
He's one of several who could, but let's go through it.
Now, Hartlepool is a constituency that has voted Labour since its creation but today it's welcoming a new Conservative MP. How did we get here? What are some of the structural reasons as to why Labour has lost a constituency it should have been able to count on? So now I'm joined in the studio by Paul Mason and Sam Bright. Thank you both, great to have you with us. Let's start by looking, as I said, at some of the more structural issues. When we're talking perhaps about changing demographics, it seems that Labour is now piling up the votes in its new heartlands of metropolitan areas amongst young, diverse, socially liberal voters.
Working as well.
Yeah, and is not getting those votes in its more traditional industrial areas where it used to be able to count on. So what sort of wider structural changes have we seen perhaps over a number of years, and how does Labour fix that?
Well, first thing to say is that's a long process. It's a process of demographic change. And it's something that in social history we're quite used to, that working populations migrate, they change, their political character changes. The generation who overthrew the French monarchy in 1848 thought the generation who overthrew the French emperor in 1870 were dissolute, non-class conscious workers. We're used to this. But the big change is that we live in a globalized economy. That if Labour politicians will be told, you've got to connect with people. You've got to be able to walk into a Wetherspoons and speak the language of the people in that pub, which is, let's put it frankly, earthy, unrestrained, unconstrained by what they would call political correctness. And that's fine. It's just that the other half of the working population works in corporations and companies where to use that language would get them sacked, and rightly so. So the way it's perceived is a cultural dissonance. Say my parents' generation, my parents are dead now, but their generation just sees modernity, technological modernity, networked lifestyles, the modern liberated lifestyles that many women live as something they just think is weird, and they want to be able to say what they think about it, and they don't feel that they can. That is at the root cause of my experience every time I go into a pub or a club or whatever, a social situation in those towns that are becoming culturally hostile to progressive politics. Now, when I say culturally hostile, there's always a division. Lee, where I come from, went Tory for the first time in 100 years. It was staunchly liberal in the 19th century. It became staunchly Labour. Now it's gone reactionary by 2,000 or 3,000 votes, more probably. But as we canvassed there in December 2019, having the door slammed in our faces by people who thought Jeremy Corbyn was a Soviet agent, we also met young people who came running, I'm not kidding, running out of their houses in their slippers to take leaflets and join us. So I'm afraid, there is a culture war. I wish it didn't exist, because I grew up in a world where it didn't exist. Since it exists, the point is to, first of all, before you start fighting and taking a side in it, to understand where it comes from. And the point I would make is that it's not just about culture. Values now are driving politics more than pure economic interest or tradition. But these aren't just kind of haphazardly chosen cultural values. They are values that arise from people's position in an exploitation process. If you are an Uber driver out here in London, you're likely to be a migrant. Your migration status might not be very stable. You're in a duck and weave economy where you're borrowing all the time. That your ethnicity, your migration status is just as much an economic fact to you as sort of being a factory worker was to my dad. And it comes across as culture, but it is deeper than culture. So then before we start saying how we're going to deal with it, I think we must try and sort of categorise it.
Yeah.
There's that coalition, do you think, that Labour has managed to bring together of quite different groups of people in the past? I mean, from what Paul's saying, it's, there has been a shift that does seem to have ended. Do you think that, Sam?
Yeah, I think it's interesting what's happened. I think it's shown that the sort of fantasies that occupy the Westminster bubble don't necessarily have a hold on the rest of the country. So there's not that sort of identification with one particular party anymore. People switch a lot more commonly We like to think of Labour areas, you know, we sort of romanticise them as former mining areas, and you know this you know great sort of staunch north. But people on the ground don't see that anymore. They don't identify the places that they live, the jobs that they do with a particular political party, and that has a problem for Labour. There's also new forms, new importance attached to both age and education in how people vote, which isn't quite as sexy for us as commentators to use as sort of as methods to explain the grand shifts of British politics. We're still attached to social class and sort of the fight, the war of the classes in the 20th century, and you know we've dismissed the stuff that actually seems to be at the root of Brexit and the Conservative victory at the last election.
And do you think that identity is a force in politics? And you touched on that. Is that, you know, there's still other factors at play, obviously economics, you know, the way society is shifting in terms of work, all of these things are true. But is there a sense that overriding all of this are questions of identity, and therefore it's very hard to say to people, well, if you vote for this party, they're not going to make you better off if the person's saying that they make me feel better about the country, about my life, about my place in it? I mean, how do you begin to tackle that?
So my identity was shaped by growing up in what I would call a class-conscious community. That is, it wasn't just a bunch of working class people who wore flat caps or went to football matches and stood up on the terraces. They had created something. They had created a culture, and that culture was incredibly solidaristic. When I meet neoliberals and they say human beings are naturally competitive and naturally like sort of jungle animals, I say, I know that can't be true. It might be true now, but when I was 16, it wasn't true in the community I came from. So that's what we mean by when we say class was dominant. Why did that go? It's no mystery. It was smashed. It was destroyed all over the world. You know, people were taken out of their factories and, you know, and atomized. There's numerous dramas, political dramas that show this really well. The film Billy Elliot, I think, shows it fantastically well. Now, that's gone, so people say, well, who am I? If I'm not characterised by my rootedness in this community and of work and solidarity, who am I? And what they're left with is the colour of their skin, their maleness if they're male. There's a big male masculine culture. They're left with locality, they're left with local rivalries and accents, and they're all also, and we never touch on this, organised crime. I know we're all in kind of grieving for the line of duty being off, but organised crime is big. Everybody working class knows somebody who could, with impunity, do them damage. This is what the middle class don't realise. No, the problem is that the values of working class communities in these different survival modes are different. And Labour's task is to construct an alliance out of them. It's like a tribal alliance. I always use the example of Helm's Deep in the second movie of Lord of the Rings. You've got to have the elves, you've got to have the dwarves, you've got to have every different tribe. Yeah, you've got to, it's no longer a spontaneous fellowship, it's an actual constructed alliance. And no Labour leader has been able to do it. Scotland has fallen off that alliance. A very large part, and again we never talk about this, we should, a big part of the Catholic Scottish working class has gone to the SNP. It was a heartland of Labour, it's gone to the SNP. We don't talk about it, but it's gone. Likewise, you know, there are successful places where Labour makes this happen. Wales is one of them. We'll see tonight the Welsh results are quite good for Labour because they're rooted in a community and almost a national story. They've supplanted, in a way, nationalism. But Labour in England it tries to represent the two tribes. I believe they are both legitimate parts of Labour, but it's not successfully doing so. And instead, what you get is I think Starmer's problem is his solution to that has been to retreat from the places and issues. I don't know whether you find this in your reporting, where these tribes don't agree.
Well,
so
seems
like
to
the
be,
Colston statue, the Jamaican deportation flight. It's not like it's just they're no-go areas for so many Labour sort of leadership level politicians.
No, that's definitely seems to be the case in that he seems to not want to offend anybody, but in the process he's not inspiring anybody either. I mean, I was reflecting on it today. I know we're focusing on structural issues, but just briefly, that I can't remember Labour saying anything about anything during this campaign. I mean, what was the big policy announcement? What was the slogan, the strap line, the sort of grand agenda? I don't think Labour pieced together any one of those things. It didn't have the small thing that you could take on Question Time to fight back against the Conservative, other than cronyism. But it also didn't have the big overarching vision either. And I mean, we're going to have to wait to see whether Starmer's got something that he'll pull out of his back pocket. I think a key thing as well is that we often portray this divide between social liberals and social conservatives as binary, which is a good point that I think Mike Buckley made today on Byline Times. But actually, it's a spectrum. Yeah. And I think that there are lots of people who are more towards that middle ground who Starmer could appeal to, but is vacating the ground entirely by not saying anything at all.
I'm a big fan of the work of the political scientist Paula Surridge from Bristol. She points out that there is the decisive constituency of what she calls authoritarian, the authoritarian left. So there's two axes. There's left-right this way, and there's authoritarian liberal on social issues. And the classic authoritarian left is somebody who wants to nationalise the railways and bring back the death penalty. And if you picture that person, you probably picture an older person. It could be a young man in a gym from a small town. Now, it is axiomatic that there's only two ways to a progressive government in this country. Either somebody puts together an alliance in which the kind of the sort of social liberal left, which is big and growing and young, makes an overt agreement with the socially authoritarian left to just do the left bit and to leave the other thing to be basic social democratic policy. That's one route. And that is, I know, because I was involved with Starmer's campaign, that's what he thinks he's trying to do. The other route is associated with Clive Lewis, with the think tank Compass, Clive Lewis and Norwich MP, which is you construct a progressive alliance of left parties, the Greens, etc. And I think that's going to have to come in. I said in last May, to the extent Starmer's thing doesn't work, you have to do what Lewis wants. There's no other way to power.
Do you think Labour would, though? I mean, Labour seems to see itself as this great sort of gargantuan power of the left and doesn't want to relinquish that role.
Well, I can understand why, but I can't remember who it is who said, political parties are like the ossified power of previous movements. And that's what Labour is at the moment. In my town, the historic moment of going from liberalism to Labour 100 years ago, and then to reverse out of it towards a very reactionary and racist and xenophobic form of conservatism. I mean, on the streets of the town I come from, I was confronted by people fantasising about rounding up Romanians, right? And they said, you won't let me say this, will you? And I said, no, go say exactly what you want. He said, well, we should put them all in a van. And when you say, well, where? You're going to take them. There's always this kind of wry smile. That's what we're up against. We're swimming in a sea of racism in many communities, not just these working class communities. Go to Surrey, go to the commuter belt and listen to there. But I'm confident that one of these two ways will work. I'm confident because when you look at where it does work, in Manchester, don't think that Andy Burnham's landslide is being delivered by Man United footballers and their wives and servants. It's being delivered by people just as working class as somebody on the outskirts of Doncaster who hates the whole idea of Labour. So I think that we have to try and go with Plan A, which is Labour becomes a radical. Its offer is a radical economic offer, but its offer on everything else, on policing, on security, on crime, on foreign policy, is basically old Labourism. And the reason I know that can work is I saw it kind of work in Greece with Syriza. Syriza said, look, we have the most radical economic offer. We are going to have a revolution against the European Union, but don't think that we're going to leave NATO. Don't think that we're going to... He came up with a series of things. Don't think we're going to do this. And I saw that work. I saw them win not just what you might call the kind of the kind of socially conservative old wing of the working class, they won big swathes of the middle class as well, the shopkeepers, the small farmers, because nobody'd ever, this is what Labour's missing, nobody'd ever come and spoken from the heart to them about their problems.
I wonder if there's some lessons as well from further afield. I mean, it's obviously a different culture, but America did vote out Trump, and it wasn't because suddenly Biden became more populist. It's because America, by majority, said no to populism. But I think a lot of what we were seeing around that was a lot of grassroots organizing from the Democrats, and also this notion within the Democratic Party that AOC and Bernie Sanders eventually did, they did support Biden, and there seemed to be some coherence there. But just to turn this on its head, because I think that's what we must always do, looking at it from a ruthlessly political angle, what are the Conservatives doing so well at? That's the question we must be asked.
Yeah.
Because they must be, what are they good at? What do they know how to deliver?
What
do you think?
They're just supremely good, I think, at selling themselves on the issues of the day. So something pops up on the news, as we saw with the gunboat sailing over to Jersey yesterday. The Conservatives will know how to act instinctively that appeals to their base in a way that Labour, I think, dithers and delays and doesn't quite know what will chime. Because I think, in fairness, Labour's got a much more difficult task. I think
because of this tension we've
because
talked
of
about,
because of the
different constituencies.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this version of the Conservative Party has also figured out that if it goes leftwards on economics, that it will cut into Labour's ground massively. It will be able to combine, as Paul said, that sort of leftward, left populist thought with the sort of right or authoritarian social policy. And that, I mean, in fairness, that creates a huge problem for the Labour Party that I don't think they've faced in some time, if ever, to be quite honest.
I think it goes possibly deeper than that. That capitalism is on life support, has been since 2008. It started on the life support of state bailouts. It's now on the life support of endless quantitative easing. And when COVID came along, the Bank of England simply started quantitative easing straight into the pocket of the Treasury. We've got monetized debt now. Now, that creates, that's not just non-austerity. That means that just like Xi Jinping and just like Trump, who spent trillions on buying the votes of the American middle class, any Conservative party that wants to, that's outside the Eurozone, so we include Canada, we include Australia, etc., can just spend money now. So the problem is, what is the future? What does the future look like? And if you then analyse the kind of negative impacts of that economic settlement, they are this: that as long as central banks pump money into a busted economy, the rich just get richer. People in Hartlepool won't be any richer for voting Tory. So that's the basis on which you cannot begin to construct the alliance. The other thing is, we have to realise this. The Tories represent capital. The Labour Party represents, as it were, historically, the working class trying to do a deal with capital. But since 2008, since the catastrophe, that deal is not really possible. So in a way, social democracy's kind of assumption that there'll be a trickle down, there'll be a bit of redistribution, doesn't happen. And the Labour membership, a strong and active Labour member, has changed. It's full of people who are against capitalism. It is. And capital can feel that. And so, the Lib Dems are not an option. Luckily, the SNP are in Scotland, because the SNP are a believable liberal capitalist party. So I think the elite can realise they lost control of a key capitalist institution, Labour Party. When we were in Jeremy's office, I used to say, Gramsci said, the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci said, the state isn't the main defence line of capitalism. It's got a trench after trench of informal defence lines. I used to say to them, the first trench is there at that door that separates your office, Jeremy, from the PLP, because the rest of them, many of them, are just outright defenders of capitalism. And they are desperate to claw back control over this party, and that's why what we've ended, it's very unfortunate that Starmer ended up holding the ring between these two very deeply rooted factions in society. And what didn't he have? He didn't have Starmerism, and he didn't have Starmerites. There's no organisation holding the ring together. I think all of that can be overcome. And I've been putting forward some potential solutions, because I'm not in favour of simply raking over the coals. We've got to get stuck in and try and solve this. I believe a Labour government is possible in 2023-24, and we should be optimistic because of Wales, because of Manchester and the rest.
Yeah. What I'm interested in as well is, and fearful of, is this sort of apathy and hostility in politics that sort of bubbled to the surface. And you can see that you've had people who voted for UKIP, voted for Brexit, now voted for the Conservative Party as protest votes and as this really sort of antipathy towards Westminster. I don't know what process needs to take place for them to come back into the established Labour Party and what we would call social democratic politics, because they seem quite far gone at that point, and they've made several decisions that's a massive kick in the groin to Westminster. That's what I fear, that we're not going to see this immediate reversal to Labour, and that it's going to take a lot more time than we actually think.
I always have this sort of central question in my head, which is how can, you know, in the modern day, how can politics meet the needs of people, which are about wanting meaning, as opposed to what political parties are there to do, which is the governance of the country. You know, if people are looking for meaning and are somewhat devoid of it because these structures that used to hold down our lives are no longer there, is politics the right place to look for that? But thank you so much, both of you. It's been really, really interesting to have you both here. Paul, thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
Sam, as always, very good insights.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Now, we've talked a lot about cronyism. We've written a lot about it. Wallpaper and Lulu Lytle and all manner of conflicts of interest have come to dominate headlines in the past weeks. There are a number of inquiries already underway into the Prime Minister's various financial spending. But what about public appointments and a Conservative project over many years to potentially influence who are the civil servants and the key people in positions of power in the media and beyond? We'll be discussing that next, but first up, here's a clip of some interviews that Sam Bright conducted with some people in Boris Johnson's constituency who had never heard of cronyism.
Have you heard about the PPE procurement scandal, all these contracts going to Conservative Party donors or not?
Sorry, mate, I haven't.
No, you haven't heard it. I haven't heard about that on the news or anywhere.
No, sorry, I haven't.
No, don't worry about it. What do you sort of watch BBC News and any papers that you read in particular?
Yeah, I do sometimes.
Yeah. But nothing. You're not seeing anything from on that.
No.
So £1 billion worth of contracts during the pandemic have been given to firms owned by Conservative Party donors.
Yeah.
It's a lot. It's a lot of money.
$1 billion.
Contracts, the coronavirus contracts that have gone to his mates. Have you heard anything about that?
No.
Nothing about that.
No.
You know, £1 billion worth of public contracts during the pandemic have gone to firms that are owned by Conservative Party donors.
Oh, is it?
£1 billion. You not heard about that on the news? No.
Not even.
No. Do you read about politics sort of anywhere in particular or nowhere at all?
I just see my daily news of BBC News.
Yeah. So the contracts during the pandemic that have been awarded to Conservative Party donors, people with close links to the Conservative Party, have you heard about that at all?
No.
Anything about the PPE procurement scandal and the cronyism that's gone on in government?
No.
You haven't heard about that? No. Not on the news, not registered.
PPE?
Yeah, like your masks. Yeah, like your masks and stuff.
What scandal?
And Paul. But now, as Hardeep said, we're going to go on and look at something after that clip where be related to why the politics is as it is, and that's our media, as a lot of people get their news from the media. And I would say, having briefly worked in it, the main focus of political control and influence is through the media. So who better to join us than first down the line, Professor of Journalism at Brunel University, Julian Petley, who's written a great article for us, which he'll outline very soon on Byline Times this week, and free at last, Dorothy Byrne, who I've never have heard many great things about, Dorothy was for 17 years head of news and current affairs at Channel 4, and then editor, whatever that means, and she has left and she is free to speak while making 6 other programs. And so if you don't mind, Dorothy, I think before we hear all your amazing insights partly about regulation, Ofcom and the media, I wonder if Julian could just outline his thesis for us, just briefly, what you said in the paper for those sad people who haven't read Byline Times.
Well, they should have done. Now, I'll explain it as best I can. It is quite complicated, but I'm sure a lot of readers of Byline Times and other papers too, well, certain papers, The Guardian maybe, will be aware that the government is heavily touting Paul Dacre, the former editor of the Daily Mail, as the chair of Ofcom. What's the problem here? Well, several problems. One is that Ofcom is the regulator of the BBC. It is the Office of Communications. Ofcom is the regulator of the BBC, and Dacre loathes the BBC, as readers of the Daily Mail will know, and that's the first problem. Dacre also loathes Ofcom, by the way, because every time Ofcom doesn't criticise strongly enough a programme of which the Daily Mail disapproves, it runs large attacks on Ofcom itself. And then the third reason really is that by so publicly trailing that it wants to appoint Dacre to this post, it actually discourages other, undoubtedly better fitted people from applying. So this is symptomatic of a much bigger problem that's now going on, which is the packing of public appointments really with Tory place persons. It is all part of the chumocracy. You know, in this country there is supposed to be a large public sector of one. Well, a public sector is not quite the right way to describe it, but the various public bodies, for example, to whom people are appointed. And this is not supposed to be just a matter of filling it up with your political chums. There is supposed to be an independent element to this, overseen by the Commissioner for Public Appointments, very much in line with the Nolan principles on public life.
And those Nolan principles, just briefly, I think they were mentioned recently at Prime Minister's Question Times, weren't they? Like transparency, fairness. Just if you outline those principles.
Yes, those are the principles. Indeed, selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, leadership.
And
all
Paul
those
Dacre. And Paul Dacre.
Yes, and all those characteristics so typical of the present government, I don't think. So what we've seen recently is a whole load of public appointments which have been made to what really have to be called political place people. Look at the Director General of the BBC and various new board members of the BBC.
Robbie Gibb.
Yeah, Robbie Gibb. We should also look at what's happened recently at Channel 4, where 2 members of the Channel 4 board have not been reappointed for no good reason at all. I mean, both Ofcom and the board thought they should be reappointed, but it's obvious that their faces don't fit. The government wants to get rid of them and appoint somebody of whom it approves. There's also been something recently about the Greenwich Museum. So I'll just give you one really blatant example here. It's not a major example, but this was the appointment to the Office of Students recently.
Yeah.
Now, the job went to the Tory peer, Lord Wharton, who was the former manager of Boris Johnson's leadership campaign. And there was a appointments committee of 5 overseeing this. No one was truly independent here. So one member of the committee was a former Tory councillor, Baroness Wilde. There was the former Tory candidate, Patricia Hodgson, and Nick Timothy, who was the former chief of staff to Theresa May. And just look at who the runner-up was, or somebody who was on the shortlist, but they wouldn't give him the job. And this was Sir Ivor Crewe, who was the former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Essex. the one-time head of Universities UK, and the Master of University College, Oxford. Right. So they give it to someone with no relevant experience whatsoever and pass over Sir Ivor Crewe. Now, if that's not an example of the public appointment system being politicised, I really don't know what is.
Brilliant summary, Julian. Thank you. So, Dorothy, chumocracy. You're 17 years at Channel 4, I'm sure, as all media organisations, a bit of a shark tank. Do you see, following the analogy of sharks and water, a sea change? Is this, with the two women who were not, after recommendation, reappointed to Channel 4, which has been in the government sites? If people don't remember, neither Boris Johnson nor Michael Gove would turn up to be interviewed in the last election, that they did knock on the door and try to interrupt. Do you see a sea change to your experience of media in these appointments, particularly in the media sphere?
Well, obviously, I'm very concerned that two women who were highly thought of both by the regulator and by the Channel 4 board were not reappointed without a proper explanation. I think that's concerning, and one would hope that the people who are therefore appointed in their place will be suitably qualified, excellent people and not political place people.
Do they make it, just for outsiders, I've never worked in a big organisation, only briefly, do they make a difference? I mean, I remember those with Marmaduke Hussey, Margaret Thatcher appointed a Conservative grandee to run the BBC, then famously, because she got rid of the Director General, Alistair Milne, who was Seamus Milne's father, I think, because of a documentary about Northern Ireland. Then he went native, and actually, he got to like the BBC. You've been at very high levels of management. Do these boards, do these trusts, do they actually influence the programme making heavily?
Well, I would say that they don't, and that is a very good and important thing, that the board of a channel or a broadcaster should not be telling the programme makers what to do, and nor should the regulator be telling them what to do. Programme makers themselves should be creating content which is commercially successful. Of course, Channel 4 is a commercial organisation, but also is dealing, according to its statutes, with subjects of great public importance and reporting them fairly, accurately and with due impartiality.
So you said should, you used the word should.
And in my experience at Channel 4, I believe that is what happened. What I think is so interesting is that when politicians complained about our programmes, our independence was protected both by our board and by the fact that the complaints went to the regulator, who viewed them properly and duly impartially, and we trusted, on the whole, the decisions that they made. We didn't necessarily always like the decisions that they made. They sometimes found against us, but broadcasters and the viewers have really trusted the system of regulation in Britain. We have really high levels of public trust in broadcasting, much higher than in newspapers, I hate to say it, than in the Daily Mail or in the government. And that was vital to public safety during the time of the outbreak of COVID. Again and again, the public turned to public service broadcasters. Our regulator, Ofcom, looked at the extent to which people trusted what they were told. And we're talking here of levels of trust of about 80% in what the British people were being told on television about should they stay indoors, how dangerous is COVID, looking at the different arguments about whether lockdown is a good idea or not. At the moment, can you trust the vaccine to be safe? You don't turn to a politician to ask them the answer to that question. People turn to public service broadcasters. And at the heart of that extraordinary achievement of the United Kingdom, that we have television that people really trust, is the success of our regulation. Round the world, our regulation is viewed as a huge success. Look how the people of the United States of America would have loved to have had proper, accurate, truthful regulation during the and after their own election and events in Washington.
So just some audience, and so I'm not completely au fait with it all, but Ofcom regulates public service broadcasting now and commercial broadcasting in terms of fairness and accountability. And this system has been sort of in place how long now, would you say, Ofcom?
Well, I can't remember when Ofcom began as a regulator, but we did have previous regulators.
You said it's much more trusted now than the previous.
It's much more trusted than it was in the past.
And the office is just around the corner. We can see it from here.
And you know, it's not perfect in many ways, but previously there was a regulator, the IBA, which broadcasters themselves did not trust to be so duly impartial in its decisions about our due impartiality. And this whole brilliant system, a really good system that this country thought of, and people come from other countries to learn about how we did it, depends on the people who are the regulators being trusted. Somebody said to me the other day that they didn't know their names. I said, good. It's good that you don't know their names, because they're just everyday proper public servants. And I'm sure that Paul Dacre is a marvellous, talented and charming man. But the problem is, can he be perceived by the public and by broadcasters as being duly impartial about broadcasting
after his
when he's launched so many public attacks, particularly on the BBC? And that undermines trust in the duly impartial regulator.
Now, we don't know if he's got the job.
Can I come back on the BBC point?
Just a moment, just to clarify, people, we don't know he's got the job. Ed Vaizey is up for it. I just wanted to clarify. So you have worked under at least 4 or 5 different heads of Ofcom, and I'm just wondering, is it a bit like Marmaduke Hussey, or does the actual head, the perception's not good, actually make a difference the day-to-day running of Ofcom?
I think that where the chair of an organisation is perceived to be very partial for or against the organisations that are being regulated, that must inevitably call into question people's sense of fairness, but also make the people who work within the organisation feel worried. They'll be looking over their shoulder. Oh, I wonder
if Paul doesn't like that.
If Paul Dacre maybe won't like it.
Or go on his famous expletive outbursts.
Who knows, because we've never had the joy of hearing his expletives. But also, actually, it can work the other way round. People start to think, I mustn't look like I'm anti-BBC and going along with Paul Dacre, so it could have the opposite effect.
So can I just, sorry Julian, I'll bring you back in. Yes, on the BBC and Dacre's role and Ofcom's role there.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Duke Hussey, who was a Thatcher appointment to the BBC governors, and didn't do too much damage. But the person who really did do huge damage to the BBC was William Rees-Mogg, who's the father of the appalling Jacob Rees-Mogg, who, when the government tried to censor a BBC programme, Edge of the Union, Real Lives, about Northern Ireland, actually took the government's side. He did enormous damage, and I think you make an important point that this is not entirely a new process. There's always been a certain amount of political placemen and women being appointed to these various public bodies. but not to the extent that is happening now. There was a speech the other day by the Commissioner for Public Appointments, Peter Riddell, who's just standing down now, and expressed quite a lot of concern about what's going on.
Yeah,
and what he says, I quote, he says, "What is different now is the breadth of the campaign and the close engagement of number 10 Downing Street. That's what's different now. You might argue, well, it's out in the open and we can see what's happening. Well, maybe so, but what we can see, in my view, is cronyism and corruption. Now, the Tories always used to complain vociferously that public bodies were stuffed with what they called Tony's cronies. But all the information that one can gather from the Public Commissioner's office is that only about 10% of appointments to public bodies since this whole system was set up in 1995 were people who expressed any particular
more experts, or even Gavin Davies from the Bank of England, who was quite close to Tony Brown, but he had experience.
Right. But I mean, so the Tories bang on about Tony's cronies, but I think now we have to worry about Johnson's jobs worth.
And Julian, I mean, what's the oversight of this? I mean, you've set out quite clearly that there has been a process of greater politicisation with regards to the Conservatives and public appointments in all manner of fields. But I mean, is there anything that can be done about that? I mean, is there anyone who they have to answer to for this process, or is it just something that the executive controls and that's that?
The Commissioner for Public Appointments, currently Peter Riddell, just standing down, is able to speak out against this and is able to intervene up to a point. What the Commissioner's role is to try to maintain a degree of independence in the committees that have advised ministers on these appointments and the appointments boards themselves. But the problem is that, like so much that is wrong with this country, it all really only works as it's supposed to work if people obey the rules. They're not law, they're rules. And this is what the great Peter Hennessy called the good chaps theory of government. And it all works all right if people obey, conventions, really, was what I'm talking about. But these people aren't good chaps or good chapesses.
So that's why we cover this quite a lot, that we have norms which are supposed to guard parliamentary behaviour, turning up to select committees, which Dominic Cummings refused to do, but no laws. So I just want to pick up then, we mentioned that only 10% of the Blair appointments had declared a political alliance. Something that, and obviously the Blair government was centrist, and we have a government which clearly isn't centrist. I want to ask both of you, but Dorothy first maybe. Is it important that Gove and Johnson have a background, at least in print journalism? Just another two observations before I forget. Paul Dacre used to have a dedicated journalist, and they were named once, who had to file weekly copy against the BBC. There was another, when he was editor of the Sunday Times, and he was named after the same, Andrew Neil of the Sunday Times also had a dedicated journalist, I think called Jonathan Miller, attacking the BBC in the 80s every day. So it's poachers become gamekeepers. But I'm wondering, and I said, the bigger question is this part of the culture wars? Are they doing this just to give their mates highly well-paid 2 days a week sinecures for many £100,000, or are they trying to change the country? Are they trying to change the media?
A good journalist would always say that I cannot attribute motivation. I have to look at the result of what somebody is doing. Actually, Gove and Johnson don't really have experience in television. I do. And therefore, they may not understand how great an error it would be for them if Paul Dacre was appointed. It would also be an error for Paul Dacre, actually. I think it would undermine what people think about him. You might not like him, but a lot of
crony,
people...
is he? He doesn't take favours from government.
He's not a crony. And I'm not sure it looks good for him if he looks like the placement of Boris Johnson, because I think Paul Dacre would say that Paul Dacre was a much greater man than Boris Johnson is, than Michael Gove is. Yeah. So I don't think it's good for Paul Dacre's reputation, but also in the end I would appeal to all the politicians to say, don't undermine something in our country that really works. We just went through a terrible emergency, and who did you rely on? What happened? We had gone through a long period in which Boris Johnson and others refused to be on TV. What did they do? The minute this pandemic began, they went on TV every night, and they went on TV every night because they had been told people trust TV. So please don't undermine that trust, because you relied on it when you needed to save the lives of tens of thousands of people.
So Julian, do you agree with that, that in a way, killing the goose that lays the golden egg, we don't have Fox News, even though Rupert Murdoch planned to do a Fox News kind of show in the UK. He dropped it, according to a memo from Rebecca Brooks, CEO of News UK, 40 million a year, and didn't think it's worth it. So we're not having it from that quarter. We don't know what GB News is like. So my question to you, do you think this is going to work? Or is it sort of a symbolic battle, like over museums, history, Hardeep could talk about this, the National Trust. They keep on trying to reverse history, but people look in history and see what happened to women, people of colour. You can't actually stop this process. So are they Canute-like, trying to turn the tide?
It is very difficult to stop this process, you're right. But I don't think one should be too dismissive of the symbolic. The symbolic matters a lot in my view. And if people feel that they're not going to get a fair crack of the whip at appointments, if they feel that public bodies, which are supposed to be impartial, are going to act in an unimpartial way, a partial way that is, that's not a good thing. I mean, we are in the middle of a culture war here, as Byline Times has pointed out in many excellent articles. This is part of the culture war. This is an attempt to discourage dissent and to neutralize what you might call areas. Well, it's a kind of winner-take-all philosophy. The government thinks it's won the election, it's got an 80-seat majority, and it wants to have power everywhere. Yeah. It doesn't like the idea that there are independent areas, or that there should be balances of power within civil society. It wants to grab every single bloody lever going and pull at them. And that is not how our society has worked in the past. I don't think it's good for democracy. So even if it is in the end only symbolic, it sends a terrible, terrible signal in my view, both to people in this society and to people abroad as well.
So one of the inspirations for setting up Byline TV was the announcement of GB News. So every time they do things like that and try to take over, we're dedicated here in our own small way to make sure they don't. And we hold fantastic guests like Dorothy and Julian to talk to us about real life experience. And you see the people around, it's going to be very difficult to shut these people up. So Julian, thanks so much for joining us down the line. Dorothy, come back. We've still got many secrets, I think, from Channel 4. And Imode, just before we go, should we have a quick look at our digital front page, which is the last thing we do? Hardeep, I've been talking too much. You take us through it. What's the front page? Because it's all about your tragic story, actually.
Ah, yes. It's Out of the Ashes is the headline we went. Mother who has 3 brothers in India, and one of them had died, and between the last week's show and now her oldest brother also died, so her oldest and her youngest, and they died within 5 days. And you know, it's there's nothing that there's nothing that brings it home more. You know, the cost of this type of populism, of this politics of division, of populists who say they care for their people, but then they don't help them, than when you see something like that firsthand happen. It's very shocking. It's hard to comprehend. Wow. And so I wrote an account about that, looking at my mother's story. And I always say that my parents have had interesting journeys. They've come from different countries and have they love Britain and they've been here for many years, but they've had very interesting big journeys, and they don't have a platform, so I have a platform. So part of that account is my mum's story of losing her brothers. And then we've also got some stuff about Labour, so out of the ashes, probably, perhaps.
Something wise that word. I'm so glad your parents did come here. It's brilliant for us at Byline TV and had you. And
they love the show.
Yes, so hello, Hardeep's parents, and very sorry to hear your news.
Oh, thank you.
Very sorry.
And it's been wonderful. So many people have got in touch with their support, and it's just important that, you know, this is just one, all over the world, this is what people are going through. And I think it's so easy, isn't it, to sometimes not understand the cost of political decisions and politics and that sort of thing. And that's why I always say it really does matter, and we need to be very aware of the fact that we live in a democracy that has a disillusioned and disengaged electorate, because at some point something like the coronavirus will come along, and then it is a matter of life and death. So it does matter who those people are behind the podiums at that time.
Well, Hardeep, I do recommend everybody to read that front page article and all the other articles on Byline Times. We'll be back here next week with more guests, and meanwhile, if you pay a little bit towards Patreon, could you stick around a bit, Dorothy?
Yes.
Okay, beers will come out, bottles will be opened, champagne corks will pop. I think Sam's still around. Sam, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm back here.
Sam's hiding behind the bushes. So stick around, get a little bit of money out, and you can come and ask us anything you like in about 10 minutes. But meanwhile, thanks for listening, and see you next week.
Good night.
This is Phase Ed Music.